Earlier today, I was feeling in the Christmassy mood, and I mean, can you blame me? I've been basically having nothing but Christmas on the mind the entire month. Well, anyway, I was on the gallery and I noticed that there seems to be a lot of love for Ebenezer Scrooge on the gallery, and despite the fact that there are many houses devoted to him and many characters devoted to him that people have created, there is not a lot of love for Bob Cratchit. In fact, there are some weird families that are named Cratchit out there. And you know, whatever, if you just want to make up the kids' names, then I guess there's no problem with that. But I found this family, the Cratchit family, and they all seem to be there, including Martha, who is the eldest daughter and doesn't actually live with them anymore because she's an apprentice. So I was kind of impressed with this, and I decided to give them a go. So now for something completely different. I'm going to put them on this lot here in Windenburg. It's a very small lot because, well, the Cratchits did not have a very impressive house. You will notice that I've made two big blocks, and it's because they lived in a semi-detached house, which even back in the early Victorian era was a pretty popular type of dwelling for people in the suburbs of London, which is where the Cratchits are supposed to live. So I suppose the first thing that we should really talk about when we're talking about London and clerks, which is what Bob Cratchit's profession is what we know about the way that they lived in the early Victorian era. So we're talking about the very beginning of Victoria's reign into maybe the 1850s, 1860s. We have essentially a lot of information, both from the book itself, as well as just how clerks may have lived in London at that time. A clerk's lot in life in early Victorian London kind of reminds me of a teacher's, or maybe right now a healthcare worker's, in that they worked very, very long hours, did not get great pay for it, and were essentially just at the beck and call of whomever was paying them. And clerks were very, very important, perhaps even more important than, say, your modern equivalent office pencil pusher was, because of course we didn't have computers, and in fact we didn't even have modern analog devices to be able to keep track of records. And so that was the primary job of the clerk, was to create and to keep whatever records were necessary to be on file for a business. And that could sometimes mean very long hours, and it certainly almost inevitably meant pretty low pay until you became management of any kind, which may or may not ever happen. And if it did, then you would usually have to rise up the ranks over a period of a number of years. Now, let's talk about fireplaces, because while I know I'm talking about clerks, you're watching me make this fireplace, and it's a very, very frustrating process because while I love The Sims 4 doesn't give us as many options for fireplaces as I would like. And one of the things that is really missing is a fireplace that is also used for cooking. So I have in the past, just like I'm trying to do now, and in fact, spoiler alert, will probably scrap, tried to essentially build a faux cooking fireplace around one of the existing fireplaces on The Sims 4. And the last time that I did that, I actually really liked the effect. But this time, it just didn't work out. Not only because I just could not get over the fact that nothing was workable. You couldn't light the fireplace, and you also couldn't use the little grill that I put into the side. But also, it looks really funny. You've got this giant stoneware fireplace that really doesn't belong inside a home. And then you've got all of these rocks around it. It just doesn't... None of it works. And I tried different colors, and I tried a variation on it with another fireplace, and that still didn't work later on. So you'll watch me go back and forth on this fireplace a lot. But here is what we do know. I have a couple of pictures that I'd like to show you. And the first one is of this fireplace. And this fireplace is a fireplace that you would have seen in the 18th century and into the early 19th century. And it is both a fireplace with a pot and a cook stove over on the side. And that's usually where you would have, lit some coals, scraped them out, and then put the bread inside. And so you would have kind of a combination in a small house like this of a fireplace and a cook stove. And that's what I was trying to go for with the grill and the giant fireplace. And you'll see in the end what I actually decided to go with, and I'm very happy with that, but it took a very long time to get to that place. So now back to clerks. And the way that clerks were paid was hourly, and they very rarely got like full salaries. And their pay would be, I don't know, it would be pittance, really. Like it was a very, very small amount. So in the book, Scrooge says that he pays Bob Cratchit 15 bob per year's salary, which just sounds so small. I don't even know how to equate it. I got some information from a book called Robert Thorne, The Story of a London Clerk, and this was actually not in the Victorian era at all, in fact. This was later in 1907, and it describes him as being a middle-aged clerk at £100 a year, and even at that point, they, in the book, were kind of implying that that was a low wage and that he wasn't living off of a lot, but he was doing the best that he possibly could with what he was given. So along with the fireplace, I had some trouble trying to figure out what kinds of windows to put in, because you're gonna see this house, if you've ever been to England, these two houses remind me of like some of the student dwellings that I had been in Lancaster. And I suppose that if I actually think about it, they probably were built in the Victorian era too, but I always just think of them as, I don't know, modern dwellings. And I suppose that's because the insides had been redone a number of times, but they're not very impressive structures. And that is the washroom, or what they would have called the wash house, and the bathing house, because right as A Christmas Carol was being written, in London there was huge reform going on, partially as a result of cholera, that was all about being more hygienic and being more safe when it came to bodily function, I guess, and a number of other things. So they had just started building en masse a number of different wash houses and bathing houses that were shared amongst, a certain population of people and would be used essentially throughout whatever group shared them. And of course, nowadays, the modern equivalent of that would really just be swimming pools. But at the time, it was definitely something that was thought of as, so on the back here, what I am doing is I'm adding essentially like a little stable that maybe would have had a horse and carriage, but for the purposes of this, because if you've ever played The Sims, then you have to have skills and that sort of thing. And of course, put a weather vane on top of the roof of our little stable here. You have to have little things that help to drive up your Sims skill sets. So I chose to put some of the more peculiar items that you need inside the little storage, what has essentially become a storage shed, but really would be like a place to stow a carriage or a carriage house if that was something that you used in the game. And then this little house that I am building is their privy. If you were very lucky, then you wouldn't have to share a privy outside. And a lot of people, even into the Victorian era, were still just doing their business in their houses in pots and then, like disposing them however they possibly could. There's a reason why cholera was a big thing in England in the 1800s is all I have to say about that. These guys are a little more hygienic than that, so they get a privy. So back to Robert Thorne, The Story of a London Clerk, which again was written almost 70 years after Christmas Carol was released. Mr. Hope's residence in the book was on Uffa Road in Brixton, and it was a semi-detached villa of red brick, and it had a grass patch between the iron railing as well as a crossbow window. There was also a larger patch of grass with a border of flowers behind the dwelling and plant boxes on the windowsills. He had nice brass bands on the windows, and he also had what he called his snuggery inside, which was essentially an office in the back room with a chair, table, carpet square, bookcase, some dictionaries, novels, tax office reports, and a few photographs of London on the walls, And then everything that he needed was on that little table for his work. So it suggested to the author that essentially everything that he needed to work, whether he was in an office or he was at home, was available to him in that little room in the back of his house. So he probably took his work home a lot. And it was tied with a red tape ribbon. This was a man who was married, had a child, and had a very similar dwelling almost 70 years later to what is described in the book. So it's pretty clear to me that the Industrial Revolution and the need for clerks did not necessarily mean that they were treated very well. And that makes sense when you think about the context of A Christmas Carol. So now, what do we know about the Cratchits? Well, from the book, you can glean that there are 4 rooms in Bob Cratchit's house, as well as a wash house. And they do use that word, so I'm thinking that despite the fact that Charles Dickens later in life actually had his own washroom within his house, I'm thinking that when we think about wash houses as opposed to wash rooms, then we're thinking one of those communal wash and or bathhouses that would have started popping up at around this time in London. And so that's the reason why I have built it on the outside of the house over kind of off to the side, because even in the book it says that she enters triumphantly from the wash house with her Christmas pudding. And that just suggests to me that the wash house is actually, even if it's still their own private one, it's a separate dwelling, or at least in a separate room to the rest of the family activities. We know that Bob Cratchit and his family are suburban, so he definitely commutes into London every day to work for Scrooge, and that he has a table and chairs for everyone in his family, especially, of course, Tiny Tim, who has a little chair next to the fireplace. What we know about London itself, and specifically the suburban life of London, is that even though bath and wash houses were beginning to come into fashion at this point, they were still kind of in short supply, because this was literally the beginning of that whole sanitation revolution that happened in London. The population of London almost doubled between 1800 and 1840, and of course the book was written and published in 1843. So you were essentially in the very midst of this crisis of an explosion in population because of the Industrial Revolution. And as a result, people who maybe otherwise would have lived A, in larger dwellings, and B, further into the city with an easier commute, were essentially moving out to the suburbs because there was literally no room for them in London. But when we talk about London suburbs, what we're really talking about is just outer boroughs. So it was still quite crammed, and you still would have been in a situation with these semi-detached dwellings where 1, 2, 3 families all may have been in the same kind of structure, even if they had separate entrances and exits. Some of the photos that I've shown you when it comes to these dwellings look pretty horrible and dilapidated, and that's because at this point they are, because of course they're modern photographs. But at the time, this would have been kind of standard for anybody who was lower middle class to middle class-ish in, again, the early part of the Victorian era. Now, 10 to 15 years from now, a lot of things are going to shift and houses are going to become more opulent. People are going to be able to afford better wages. It's going to be a different scenario than what Mr. Cratchit and his family are going through right now. The other thing, of course, about the Victorian era, especially the early Victorian era, is we don't have lights yet. So everything is candlelit, and I'm trying to use that new feature, or newish feature at least, on The Sims of the off-the-grid activities and skills. And I actually kind of love that feature. I don't know about you guys. Please let me know in the comments if you are a Sim player, if you like the fact that you can actually use off-the-grid stoves and water and that sort of thing, because that really kind of heightens the gameplay for me a lot. But then, of course, as soon as we fix that, then it's time to cheer up the place. And so I can absolutely imagine the Cratchit children making paper decorations and gathering greenery and homespun decor to put on their walls. And I'm also, of course, just going around the room and putting other things on the walls that I believe that the Cratchits would make use of, like shovels and coats for when they have to go outside and use those shovels, of course, and some herbs on the wall, as well as a Yule log candle. And even though Christmas trees were coming into fashion at this point, I don't believe that the Cratchits would have had enough room or enough money to take advantage of that new trend yet. So even though at some point I do put a Christmas tree out in the front yard, I ultimately abandoned that idea because I just don't think that it feels right or looks right given their dire circumstances when we meet them in the book. I think that the home, as simple as it looks, is quite cheery in its own adorable little way. And when we look in the windows here in just a moment, then you'll be able to see just how inviting and how warm and how welcoming the little Cratchit sitting room ends up becoming after I finally get the fireplace right and in working order. And of course we see Tiny Tim's little chair by the fire. And if we look outside of the bedroom windows upstairs, as dawn is breaking, we can make our way out onto the London streets. I hope that you enjoyed this speed build. The house has already been uploaded onto the gallery, so you can go and find me. My ID on the gallery is callmeoldaf. You can download the house and play with your own Sims on it. If you would like to see more Sims content from me, then please like this video, give it a share, and then tell me in the comments below what kinds of Sims builds you would like to see me create. And in the meantime, I will see you tomorrow for another Vlogmas video.